Sounds great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. What I'll do just to ensure that we optimize the time that we have together is I'll sort of fill in these open spots as they arise with any presentation that I'm doing. So it'll be a little bit disjoint, but it actually happens in some reasonably discrete chunks, so I can deal with them a piece at a time and hopefully keep the message reasonably coherent. So where we left off from my discussions this morning was we sort of recapped the strategy of council, the guiding principles that direct the organization, and the summary of the 2015 to 2017 budget accomplishments that had been achieved by the previous council in both operating and capital programs target around those four focus areas for the city. Part of the reason, as I pointed out, to go through that is to demonstrate that we are on a strategic path that was set by previous council. That strategy gives rise to annual budgets, and those budgets are underway and being executed. So I'll continue on with a bit of a recap through 2017 and use that to frame up 2018. And where I'll stop in order to allow us to move forward into the presentation that's coming is I'll stop before we start talking about the 2018 budget, so that piece is not disjoint. So when we start talking about 2018, we'll continue on that path. So what you see in front of you now is a slide of the 2017 budget and the sources of revenue identified with that budget. It's about $163.4 million worth of revenue. About 70% of that comes to us through property tax. And just an interesting breakdown on the property tax itself. In Grande Prairie, each community is a bit unique in terms of the mosaic of taxpayers that contribute to that. In Grande Prairie, we're about 57% residential, 27% commercial, 14% industrial, and then a residual that's linear tax. So very heavily weighted toward the residential component, and as we seek to develop, as we talked to Brian Glavin earlier about our economic development mandates, some of the things that Brian is constantly trying to do is attract that commercial tax base and even industrial tax base so that we can rebalance against residential. There is a rule of thumb in municipal finance. Don't hold me to this, it's not mathematically precise, but generally speaking, residential taxes collected cost you money. I've heard different numbers from $1.20 to $1.30 for every dollar of tax that you collect residentially because of the nature of the services that need to be provided for residences. Commercial taxation about breaks even, and industrial taxation consumes less than it costs. So you make money on industrial tax revenue, you about break even on commercial, and residential tax revenue costs you money. And where that becomes relevant for us is as we grow as a community in our residential development, as our population grows, it puts increased pressure on municipal services that are not fully covered by the revenues associated with residential property taxes. So interesting piece of the pie then, the property tax revenue at about 70% has four distinct components. Second highest source of revenue for us is user fees, which are about 17%. And this is one of the things that we will look at in 2018 to see how we compare to other municipalities. Even in the short time since I have arrived in Grande Prairie and started to work with City Council and City Administration, I've encountered things like user fees that haven't been changed in 10 years. And clearly they were either wrong then or they're wrong now, unless we can imagine a circumstance under which the costs associated with those user fees have been flat for a 10-year period. Not likely that that's occurred, so a review, one of the things that we will undertake, and in fact it's included in the 2018 budget, is management will undertake a complete review of the fees and charges, all of the fees and charges in the city of Grande Prairie, and come back to you with a understanding of where they are relative to where they used to be, where they are relative to other municipalities, and including places like the neighboring county, and get some perspective as to whether or not the user fees ought to perhaps constitute a higher portion of recurring revenue into the revenue stream in the budget.
I see Councillor Clayton with a question.
Thank you, Mayor Gibbon. Mr. Nicolay, could you tell me if you happen to know our percentage of revenue from grants, et cetera, being around 3%? How does that compare to the other mid-sized cities of Alberta?
I don't know that the answer to that, but that's a very good question. And as we go through and look at user fees and property taxes and the analysis we'll do throughout 2018, those will be the kind of metrics that we'll be able to bring back to you. So 17% user fees, and the user fees will be reviewed in 2018. About 11% is other revenue, and that includes things like investment revenue from the city's reserves, the franchise fees that are levied against the utility operations in the area, et cetera. And then about 3% is grants and transfers. Next slide then looks at the 2017 budget expenses, and we see the same 163.4 million. So we balance the budget every year. That's a mandate for municipal corporations in Alberta. You can't deficit finance them. So of the 163.4 million in expenses in 2017, about 45% of those are associated with what we now call infrastructure and protective services, 23% community living, 15% corporate services, about 9% of our total budget expenditures go toward debt servicing, 5% toward capital, and about 3%, or the residual, is consumed through council and the city manager's office. Last slide of colorful pie charts is the 2017 capital budget, and we'll look at the 2018 budgets in much the same way, but just to put things in context, 2017's capital budget was about $36 million. About 72% of that went toward what we now call infrastructure and protective services, about 19% into community living, 7% into corporate services, and 2% into the city manager's office. And city manager's office is where we would include the economic development area. So that's a quick recap of 2017, just to put things into perspective. So it's 160 to 170 million dollars in operating, and 35 to 40 million in capital, and that's sort of a reasonably consistent pattern over the years.
Councillor Bressy.
Quick question about revenue. Would any grants we receive in lieu of taxes, would that appear under property tax or grants and transfers?
Property tax.
Corporate Services Director.
It's in if it's a grant in lieu of property tax, it would be in the property tax revenue.
Thank you.
Susan and I will get our sign language a little more precise as time goes on. Next slide then shows how this manifests into our community. So we've got a budget that has been set to serve a strategic purpose and is executed annually and reviewed annually and executed annually by the organization. And if we start to look at some of the comparators, and this is always a risky exercise because all we're looking at is one. As I pointed out earlier, we've got user fees constituting 17% of our total revenue. If another comparable municipality has user fees representing 67% of its total revenue, it would have a very low tax base, but a very high user fee base. And these kind of charts that you often see used to compare the municipal tax burden across various municipalities doesn't reveal the total cost to a consumer. One of the missions that we will have for 2018 is to get a set of data that does do that. So we can look much more precisely at what it costs for a resident to live in Grande Prairie versus Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, Red Deer, et cetera, taking into account normal levels of activity in user fee supported municipal services and a sample property for the municipal tax portion of their cost. In any event, with that warning, these are the kinds of metrics people see quite often. So you can see in the far right, the city of Grande Prairie is currently leading, in 2017, is leading the province for mid-sized municipalities in their 2017 municipal taxes. So this is just the municipal tax component. Grande Prairie is about $200 cheaper than that, $250 cheaper than that. Lethbridge gets a little less expensive. Airdrie and Medicine Hat are about the same at about $1,600. And the County of Grande Prairie, just to make sure that we're comparing relevant numbers, for that same size residence would pay about $1,250. So a significant difference between County of Grande Prairie and City of Grande Prairie in the tax burden. And there are some very good reasons for that when we start to do the arithmetic. There are some reasons for that that are found in or have given rise to things like our advocacy on the police funding model that's used in Alberta, and how municipalities like Grande Prairie pick up the full cost of policing, whereas smaller municipalities and counties and MDs do not. Those are significant costs for us. Those are measured in the tens of millions of dollars for cities like Grande Prairie. In any event, that's how the 2017 budget year would manifest in terms of the impact on tax burdens to as compared with other mid-sized municipal centers within Alberta. I thought it also useful before we get into 2018 to take a reasonably close look at some of the current and future analytical tools. And this is a bit preemptive because I know as a new councillor coming in and as councillors that have had a few years experience now, and as things are changing, the nature of the questions are becoming quite probing. You know, what does it cost to do this? What does it cost to do that? Do we track this? Do we track that? These are all excellent questions, and what we need to be able to do is to demonstrate to you that we do track the costs, we do track the performance. We will find better mechanisms going forward to ensure that you are in on that, you see the results of that exercise. Our communication on these fronts has not always been where it needs to be going forward. But we use a number of current and future analytical tools to try to get at being responsive and even proactive in the provision of our services to the community. The first one is one that you the members of the council who are returning will be quite familiar with. They're what we call base service area reviews. And we have a manager in charge of this, Patricia Curtis, works directly through my office, so there's no barrier to accessing various service areas and doing a objective set of analysis on how the service area is performing. Authoring a report that looks at the key metrics in that service area, and then reporting back, preparing a very detailed report for the service area itself, and preparing a summary report like this that goes to council. So over your term, in the 4 years to come, you could expect to see these types of service profiles done on many of the key areas of the city, and they will cover such things as the mission of the department, the cost of service in the most recent year, a full description of what service is provided by that department, something we refer to as service justification. So if there are legislative reasons why the service is being provided by the municipality, you'll see them. You'll see the kind of standards and bylaws and specifications that are achieved in the area. And then we look at an assessment of the performance. And this is not intended to be a report card on the area. It's intended to be a tool through which we can achieve continuous improvement. This, by the way, and I'm glad we had a chance to do this before the priority-based budgeting presentation, this is the kind of thing that has given rise to thinking that is now called priority-based budgeting. What you see in front of you for the engineering services area are a set of metrics that start to reflect the volume of service agreement activity that's occurred from 2004 to 2017. So you can see in each of those years the number of construction completion certificates, final acceptance certificates, number of agreements that are being processed through the engineering area. And we can see volumes of activities at different times in Grande Prairie's history. Similarly, with permit activity, we can see permit activity from 2008 to 2017 in this depiction. Everything from barricades and storm connections through to lot grading and driveway permits. So when you wonder about the level of activity that's occurring in the community associated with the permitted activities of the community itself, these are being tracked on an ongoing basis, and we use them to do our manpower planning, our resource allocation, and our refinement of performance in any of these areas. Similarly, on this one, capital construction activity in the community, you can see again from 2008 to 2017. So my purpose of including this one, it wasn't to get into a detailed discussion on engineering services. In fact, this engineering services report has not yet been delivered to council, so you would expect to see a base service profile report like this coming to you yet as City Council. But my purpose was just to show you the kind of analysis that goes on behind the scenes. We'll tick up its visibility so that you get a chance to see it in meaningful ways. But the work is being done. Grande Prairie does an excellent job of making sure that gets done. Next slide gets into some more detail. Talks about the target groups or customers that are served by this service area. Talks about ways in which we currently partner and how this service area has internal and external partners. It starts to look at cross-city comparisons. And these, Patricia has become very good at making sure that we're, as close as humanly possible, we're doing apples-to-apples comparisons when we look at other municipalities. But in an engineering services area in Red Deer, how many full-time equivalent people are dedicated to that? How many in Lethbridge? How many in Wood Buffalo? And the real advantage of these kinds of numbers is not so much to find a solution, like if Lethbridge can do it with 17 and we're doing it with 26, we must be able to do it with less people, but more to cite the anomalies. So where we do comparisons of what are reasonably expected to be apples to apples, and we see an anomalous number or anomalous pattern, that attracts our attention and causes us to go have a look. I will caution against conclusion. It's so tempting to conclude. And without digressing into storyline too much, I actually had an experience in this regard many years ago when I was doing a financial analysis on the financial performance of the transit property in a mid-sized Alberta municipality in which I was employed. And as I was looking at what was the key indicator in transit properties was something called revenue cost ratio, and it was used pretty much universally across the industry to gauge the performance of a transit property and show it against others. And I found our transit property to be very much in the pack, but there was one transit property in Alberta that was exemplary. Its revenue cost ratio was absolutely outstanding. And so I jumped in my car and drove to that municipality to spend some time there and determine what it was they were doing differently in their transit property to get such a magnificent revenue cost ratio to occur. And what I found was the difference was how they counted the beans. So it was the cost of maintenance for the transit fleet was not borne by the transit department. That was borne in fleet services. And so the accounting for the cost of maintaining the fleet was something that was in the general tax base. The performance of the fleet of transit vehicles in that particular municipality didn't have to cover its cost of maintenance. So frequently what seems to be a exemplary or an anomalous sighting in these kind of statistics ends up on closer investigation to be something that's not really an example of better performance. We chase them anyway so that we find if there really is somebody that's got a better way of doing something. And one thing I have noticed quite different between the public sector and the private sector, the public sector will share its success stories very, very easily. When I was in the private sector, in oil and gas, for example, it would not have been our inclination to be telling the industry how we're saving money drilling wells or doing construction projects. So that information is very open, very, very well shared in the public sector. And when we track these kind of city-to-city comparisons, we do chase them down to see whether or not there are reasons why municipalities are outperforming us. And we start to adopt their techniques wherever practicable. That goes through a series of cross-city comparisons, things, in this case, things like who does the subdivision approval, who does the roadway naming, what kind of management programs are in place for capital, et cetera, and yields a pretty good educational document, both for the department, for the senior management team, and ultimately for council. So this is an example of a report that would actually go to City Council and will at some point. And it concludes with a set of recommendations and action items that council can be assured are being pursued if they're within budget, or there will be a specific request for the activities to occur after having delivered this report to council. So quite a robust set of analysis that goes on in the key service areas of the organization. Every single service area, including the city manager's office, is subjected to this. There was a report done on the city manager's office before I came here. So every one of the areas in the city is can be subjected to one of these, and the rotation through the system is done through the corporate leadership team. Next slide then is an example of another analytical tool that we did, and this one was quarterbacked by David Ollinger this year, as I believe in previous years as well. This is something called the Citizen Budget, which again, I cite both of these because they are early foundational blocks to what we will hear in 15 minutes or so is priority-based budgeting. So the first one was get at real metrics and get at examining different ways to provide services. That's done through the base reviews. The citizen budget process is a way in which we can go out into the community and start to gauge what the priorities of the community are with respect to the services provided by the municipality. This has been done this is the 4th year that this tool has been used. Next slide. It's used to engage residents in the budget process. It provides education on city operations. It also provides the residents that choose to access this, it's accessible through the website, some illustrations on how tax dollars are invested for them. So it's kind of a live item that gives them a chance to see that. The service is contracted through an outside agency, so we're not influencing the results of our residents when they're completing this. It's an organization called Open North. And there will be an opportunity to use this type of scenario in gauging the priorities that we will be seeking to assess in priority-based budgeting. In terms of the use of the tool this year, it was active you got the right one. Yep, it was active on the city's website from September 25th to October 20th, so almost a month. During that month, there were 403 responses. And what we asked them to do this time, there have been various uses of this tool. In some uses of the tool, it got very detailed and was seeking to really let residents play around with a bunch of different priorities. What we thought we would do this time is just ask them to cite their top 3 priorities and their bottom 3 priorities. And the rationale there was, if we're moving into priority-based budgeting and we're going to do a real deep dive on trying to get at understanding the priorities of the Grande Prairie community, we didn't want to do a thorough and robust process in 2017 and then replace it with something quite different in 2018. So we thought rather than stop the process, we would do it at a high level. And we found some interesting responses. The top 3 priorities in terms of what came back in the responses during that 1-month period are perhaps not surprising in their entirety. Crime was number 1, enforcement and policing. So still very much on the minds of our community. And to those of you who have just spent 6 to 8 weeks or more campaigning and knocking on doors and talking to people, please don't think that I'm trying to tell you what the priorities of the community are. You heard probably most, if not all of these firsthand in your interactions with the community. But this is a systemic way to get at it. So crime enforcement and policing, road and infrastructure construction and maintenance, perhaps not surprising. This is September, October, so the downtown construction project would have been well underway. And we do have a short season in which road construction can occur throughout Grande Prairie. So Horacio's crews are out there, very visible to the population. And one that surprised me a little bit, because it was September, October, so we'd seen no snow yet that would cause this to be top of mind, but snow and ice removal. So even long before we get a winter season, if you ask people in Grande Prairie what's a priority for them, snow and ice removal is a priority, and they remember it year round. So I think later on you're going to hear a interesting idea that Horacio and his team have come up with in infrastructure and protective services on that theme, and it arises from the fact that we do hear this quite regularly. I'm hoping this was just an anomaly.
I see Councillor Blackburn.
Thank you. Just a question about the sample size. First of all, is this typical from the past years, number of responses that we get, and would it be considered an adequate sample in a typical survey?
Short answer is yeah, it's about typical of what we would have expected in prior years. 400 is not bad in a population like ours in terms of statistical significance, although when we do things like a satisfaction survey in the community, we tend to want to focus that to ensure that we get at a variety of demographics. So even though the number in the satisfaction survey might be relatively similar, we would have done a more purposeful job of trying to make sure that we hit the variety of demographics in the community. What I seriously hope happens as we move, no, hope's not a good strategy. What we intend to achieve as we move into a priority-based budgeting approach is a much more engaged public. So if the public believe that through their participation in programs like this, a difference will occur, that they will be heard, and it feeds into something that doesn't get overly bureaucratically filtered, doesn't get taken off on a wrong direction, I think we can expect that we'll see higher levels of participation. And this was only open for a month, and it wasn't something that we went out looking for people. This was people finding this on the website and participating in the survey. If we went out and tried to solicit participation, I think we could do much better than this. So snow and ice removal, I won't preempt Horacio's presentation that you will hear about tomorrow, but there has been some significant work. This is a significant issue in the community. It is more top of mind now that we've had snow for the past 3 or 4 days. I'm already getting phone calls, as I know some of you are as well. The bottom 3 priorities also came up, and some of those are perhaps not surprising either, although there was a bit of a surprise in this one. The culture and heritage facilities and programs was one of the bottom 3 priorities, which might reflect that people are pretty satisfied. It's not something that is problematic for them. So it's not top of mind, not because they don't feel that it's important, but they feel that their needs are being met. Yeah, they're satisfied. So again, a more precise use of a tool might try to differentiate between people who just don't think this is a good use of money versus people who are satisfied with the level of money or level of resources that are being put into that area. Transit came up as a low priority, and in terms of numbers, that's not uncommon in urban centers. Alberta is a very car-driven economy, as everybody knows. The vast majority of people use their private vehicles to get around. For the people for whom transit is the only answer, the only viable way that they can achieve mobility in a community, I would suggest transit would be very, very important to them. They obviously didn't dominate this response group. And the one that took me a little bit by surprise, because I'm standing here telling you over and over again how we're going to do a better job of this, is a bottom priority being communications and public engagement. And I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. I believe we could do a much better job of this, and I think council believes we could do a much better job of this. And I would hate to be dedicating all that resource to doing a much better job of something that ought not to be done at all. I don't think that's what I would read into the fact that this sits as a low priority. In any event, as we build our communication and engagement strategies going forward, we'll be cautious, as we will on all of our strategies, to not be out trying to do something very, very well that shouldn't be done at all.
I see Councillor Clayton with a question.
Mayor, given on that last sort of note, I tend to think that not everything can be top three for people when they're taking a survey. So I think that although most of us around the table during election season would have heard that it is a priority to people, the other things were possibly just more of a priority.
That could very well be. The next couple of slides just go through a more detailed depiction, and I hadn't intended to stop on them, but you can see the range of alternatives that people were given to pick top and bottom and sort of how they responded. A much more refined use of a tool like this is what you can expect in priority-based budgeting. We also included in the package some selected comments, and this was not easy because there were a lot of comments. The respondents were given an opportunity to write something of their own choosing as well. But some of these selected comments that we included, I think, are quite insightful. Road maintenance category should include snow and ice removal. That's part of maintaining the roads in the winter. Nothing's more important than cutting down crime, as well as all other aspects of life in Grande Prairie suffer due to crime. Recreation facilities are critically important because it's too cold outside half of the year. So these are things that you will have heard, I'm sure, plenty as you talk to people, but we're hearing them, documenting them, and make sure that we're cognizant of them. The please get rid of photo radar and get boots back on the ground for speed enforcement. In December, you will see the Safe Roads initiatives come forward in a very comprehensive report to the Infrastructure and Protective Services Committee that will help to perhaps correct some of the misinformation about enhanced enforcement activities and put it in perspective in terms of what we're achieving in the community. A well-maintained and free-flowing road network is fantastic. Talk about the traffic lights that are currently in the city, and this one I found to be quite interesting, and perhaps the systems that we currently have in Grande Prairie are not quite sufficiently visible to people, but I think Grande Prairie's automated traffic control system is perhaps leading edge, maybe even bleeding edge in North American communities. It is a very, very sophisticated system to ensure that you're not sitting endlessly at a red light when there is no traffic there. So I think that gentleman or that person's comments might actually be resolved already and perhaps just hasn't really fully experienced that yet. Again, on the next page, several years of snow and ice removal has seen a definite increase from previous years. I think this council or the previous council was responsible for a lot of that progress. The windrows on the driveway coming up again, and I'll only skip over this one because you will hear some ideas, some strategic ideas from Horacio tomorrow on that. The idea of the Bobcat plowing around and making a difference. We are getting people that are starting to find solutions that we think will make the community quite happy. Safe and up-to-date infrastructure. Please consider making Revolution Place, making a Revolution Place upgrade a top priority. We have no pride in the building as it is, and it's weighing the downtown down. Revolution Place is something that has come up on several occasions. There have been several attempts to look at different plans as to what can be done in Revolution Place. That might be something that turns out to be a strategic initiative for this council. Not necessarily because you heard it here through citizen budgeting, but I'm sure you heard it on the campaign trail. We hear it in the community. And as we try and balance budgets and look at a facility like Revolution Place, as it ages, falling further and further out of market, so not able to compete with Dawson Creek for lucrative acts coming in and doing concert performances, for example. We do need to find some kinds of solutions that stop that from becoming a burden on the tax revenues of the community. So that might be something that comes up this year. And again, as a second reference to photo radar. So not surprising, some of the things that we heard in the citizen engagement or citizen budget process, but an interesting cross-section of ideas that's come forward. And for me, I think probably the most important thing was that this community is already used to participating and setting the priorities of the the council and the budget and the city administration. And so as we engage efforts to transition toward priority-based budgeting, and that increases the interface between the community and the established priorities of the municipality, I think we're going to find a very receptive community that already knows how to do that. Just a very quick recap of other analytical tools. Priority-based budgeting, I mentioned again and again and again with full apologies. Both multi-year, so not everyone that does priority-based budgeting does it multi-year. We are mandated by the province of Alberta to do multi-year budgeting, and so it's our intention to keep doing that. And we'll do priority-based budgeting in a multi-year context. It's also our intention to continue to do the multi-scenario budgeting. So as we go through priority-based budgeting, we should be able to talk about a 3%, a 0, and any scenarios that council might want us to consider as we're doing our administrative work and preparing budgets. You ought to be able to direct us to do those considerations, and we need to come back with a budget that meets that kind of a mandate. It is a very interesting exercise for an organization to go through determining what it would do to respond to different levels of revenue accessibility in the community. We do it in business all the time. And then fiscal health, and I won't steal the thunder of the presentation from Resource X, but one of the very interesting features of priority-based budgeting is a unique tool that allows you to truly assess the fiscal health of your municipal corporation. We tend to do that in municipalities on a year-to-year basis, looking at whether we balance the budget, looking at how we compare to others. But Councillor Palat, I think yesterday in the Infrastructure and Protective Services Committee meeting, you brought up, what about the stuff that's out there just beyond the horizon, and how do we anticipate the kinds of investments that we may need to make in the community that are not yet visible within the short-term planning horizon. That's one of the things that the fiscal health attribute of priority-based budgeting is going to help us to get at. Lean business process improvement, you will see those results, and you should start to pick it up in the way in which your administration interacts with you in the committee meetings and in council. We need to help you to make informed decisions. We should be speaking to you in data, in information, in evidence, so that evidence-based decision-making can occur throughout the organization. We're certainly going to be doing that as a management group. You should start to see that manifest in the committee meetings and council meetings at a much higher level. And that comes from being able to use tools like Lean, whether it's at a yellow belt, which is a very sort of almost superficial review of everything that we do as a process, right through to this Lean Six Sigma black belt training, which is highly mathematical and highly analytical. You should see that coming forward. And similarly, and I think I qualified myself on the project management side, Grande Prairie has historically done an exemplary job in project management. Some of the things that have been done here, even in recent years, have been done exceedingly well on very limited resources. But the discipline of project management is quite rigorous, and will increase our focus on ensuring that people have access to proper training, proper education, so that they can do project management on a more thorough basis. And that, Mr. Chairman, completes the introductory portion of the 2018 budget, and it's just about right on time for our 1:30 call. I think the technical folks need 3 or 4 minutes just to set up for the call. So if we could break there, I can take questions afterward, just so we're not leaving that call on delay.
Okay, that's great. So we'll take a 3 to 5 minute break while we get our presenters who are calling in organized. And so council, don't leave the room. Stand up, but stretch, but maybe don't leave the room. Okay.
Yeah.
can see on the slide.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of council. This is a presentation by a company called Resource X, that is the company that is bringing priority-based budgeting out to municipalities just like ours. I actually had an opportunity to meet them and spend some time with them in one of the courses that was run in Denver recently, and found it to be exceedingly informative. And even at this level, as we're transitioning toward priority-based budgeting and looking at a 2018 set point and then into 2019 and beyond for strategy, I thought it would be very valuable for council to see what it is that we're really talking about when we talk about priority-based budgeting and how it might manifest here in Grande Prairie. So with that, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you and any of the other members of your team that might be on the call, and let you proceed.
Sounds great. Bob, thanks for the introduction, and nice to hear your voice again. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this coming through clearly?
Yeah, I believe it is.
Okay, great. Well, hello on the other end of the line. My name is Chris Fabian, and I am one of the co-founders of Resource Exploration, indeed the company that is going to help bring priority-based budgeting to life for your city. We're very excited to have the opportunity to work together. Priority-based budgeting at this point has now been implemented in over 180 communities. I need to actually update this slide. And this is since about 2008, so about over the last decade or so. The process itself was developed in a local government environment. I was a local government practitioner, and certainly it was a response to a financial crisis when our communities were going through the Great Recession within the United States. We developed a methodology that would help our elected officials like yourselves prioritize on a basis that everybody could understand. It was a methodology that helped our organization better communicate to our elected officials what it is that we provide by way of the services that we provide, how much each of those services cost, and ultimately how they translated to your goals, the results that you're trying to achieve for your society. And while we developed this methodology, again, as a response to help us balance the budget in the financial circumstance that we were facing, what we were thrilled about was the resonance that this process had, not only for organizations trying to balance the budget or dealing with less resources, but ultimately, and this really came to life when we started to work more with Canadian communities, we found that the process works just as well for communities who have new resources to allocate, constantly ensuring that those resources are going to be aligned with the results that matter most to your citizens overall. Within Canada, I've been pleased to work with now you all. Strathcona County is one of the front runners and leaders in the implementation of priority-based budgeting. Beaumont, Alberta, the City of Edmonton, as well as Edmonton Police Services, Lethbridge, St. Albert, and even Alberta Health, one of the ministries at the province level. These are among your neighboring communities who have gone through this exercise. And while the process lends itself to large organizations, we've worked in Sacramento, California, Toledo, Ohio, Edmonton, Alberta, obviously. It also has proven to be very scalable, working for communities on the smaller side, including communities like Beaumont. Here in Colorado, there's a community called Victor with a population of about 300 people, and then everywhere in between. With 180 communities having gone through this, the national associations, actually the international association that represents city managers and county managers and provides professional accreditation, the International City and County Management Association, or ICMA, declared priority-based budgeting a best practice based on its ability to be implemented for organizations of all sizes, as well as being a process with a repeatable methodology, something that every community can go through the exact same steps and achieve the exact same results as other communities who have gone before you. And finally, the third criteria, besides scalability and repeatable methodology, the third criteria for the establishment of the best practice was proven results. We can look back on communities who have gone through implementation and those who have sustained their work throughout the years and actually see the results, the net effects of having put this methodology into practice. So for today, I really wanted to give you an overview of what you're about to embark upon for the implementation of priority-based budgeting. I thought I would begin my presentation with a discussion about why communities get into this, what are some of the motivations, because it's really quite fascinating. There are different reasons that drive leaders to implement priority-based budgeting, and yet there are all sorts of different applications. Our job is to constantly educate all of the users about the different ways that PBB is being applied so that you have all of these opportunities in your future. I get to plant the seeds. So I'll start with a few stories and a few case studies. After that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time, not a lot, but a little, going into the methodology itself, the steps, so that you have a sense for where this goes. And then finally, have the chance to demonstrate some of the tools and certainly take some questions as we go. Bob, please feel free to interrupt me along the way if there are questions or anything that I can clarify in the middle of the presentation, but certainly I'll be sure to pause and take some time at the end for some discussion. So starting with why communities get into priority-based budgeting, what drives them, what is some of their motivation? I thought I'd start with one of the communities in Alberta, which is Strathcona County, because it's been so interesting to us. Like I said, we developed priority-based budgeting when we were trying to balance the budget, when we had less resources available, and we had to make some very difficult decisions about how we were going to allocate what was at the time scarce resources. Strathcona County, completely on the other end of the spectrum, their elected officials used priority-based budgeting to understand clearly how each and every service was aligned with the results that they were trying to achieve. And at the end of their work, with a very clear picture about every service they provide and the cost, they determined, actually through a study of the budgeted amounts for each programs and the actual spending, they determined that they could actually provide a refund to some of the taxpayers, or lessening the overall intake of resources from their community. We had never seen that before, and they are the only community who has done this. But for them, this was an appropriate use of priority-based budgeting, is figuring out exactly how much they needed to fund their results, and now they're absolutely looking at different ways that they can allocate resources towards new results overall in Strathcona County. In Kalamazoo, Michigan, a little bit different story and very fascinating. They too went through priority-based budgeting for every service offered throughout the entire city government. So every service identified, a price tag put on every service, and those services scored and ranked relative to their community outcomes. But something else took place in Kalamazoo that's worth noting. They have a unique community where some local philanthropists have donated substantial amounts of money to the city. And they have specific goals. And one of the goals is ending generational poverty. And what Kalamazoo is able to do with their priority-based budgeting process is use the lens of priority-based budgeting to focus all of these new resources that have come into the city, specifically targeting this goal. So for every new program that is on the table to be funded, every new idea, they put it through the scoring criteria that I'll explain to you in just a moment, and evaluate whether or not it is in fact going to help them with this overall goal of ending generational poverty. I bring this story to light for you because PBB has proven to be this great engine for churning up new resources to allocate, and whether your community is experiencing an influx, a surge in new resources, or whether you are able to reallocate from within, the next question to you as elected officials is, well, what results are we going to focus on? And Kalamazoo has really set the bar high among our communities for establishing something so bold as ending generational poverty and using PBB now to gear their resources towards the achievement of that result. Switching gears slightly, the third of my 4 introductory stories is Toledo, Ohio. Again, a totally different type of application of priority-based budgeting. Toledo actually had a partner involved when they decided to venture into PBB, and that partner was their local Chamber of Commerce, the Chamber, of course, representing the private sector within the city. And where the city of Toledo is right now, they have completed their first year of priority-based budgeting, and they took all of their data, again, all of the programs that they provide and the cost of those programs, and they've shared it openly with the Chamber of Commerce. And they have a specific goal in mind. Toledo has been no stranger to economic strife, and they have, unfortunately, throughout the last many years, had to deal with reducing the budget. They've had to deal with layoffs. And all throughout in that conversation has been a lurking, gnawing perspective from the private sector that maybe we should privatize services, or maybe we should be looking at running government more like a business. But what is taking place right now is a totally different spin on that type of a conversation. It's in the spirit of partnership that the city is sharing its data openly with the private sector in hopes of finding ways that they can create new public-private partnerships that are more efficient than how the city has been running some of their programs before. There are currently 14 proposals coming from the chamber, coming from the private sector interests back to the city that are all under consideration. Things as bold as taking the entire street sweeping operation off the city's hands and allowing the private sector to actually run that business, allowing the city to take that staff group and reallocate them to new programs that the city can't possibly start on their own, all the way down to a local city arborist program where they're looking at a public-private partnership for that program as well. So another thing that you can do with priority-based budgeting is use your data to engage, in Toledo's case, the private sector. In other communities, they've used the data to engage the public sector if the private sector is just a little bit too large of a leap. And this whole spirit of collaboration, finding different ways to partner on similar programs that you provide is one of the major outcomes that is a takeaway from the work. Lastly, my fourth story by way of introduction is the city of Boulder, Colorado. Boulder has now just about adopted their 8th straight budget using priority-based budgeting. In their words, it is the framework for all financial decisions that are before the elected officials, 8 straight years. And this is truly how PBB is intended to be used. When Boulder started, what you're looking at down here with this graphic, this represents where you too will be in not too long. They've taken every program, they've put a cost on those programs that they provide, and they've been scored and ranked using their results as evaluation criteria. And what you're looking at here is the city's spending for each quartile. Quartiles have a specific meaning in priority-based budgeting, where quartile 1 are those programs that have the greatest degree of influence on the results you're trying to achieve. Quartile 2 are also very highly ranked programs. They have a tremendous degree of influence as well, just not as high of an impact as quartile 1 programs. Then you have quartile 3 programs, which score relatively less than quartile 2. And finally, quartile 4 programs, which have the least amount of influence on your results. But it's a relative differentiation. And what you're noticing here within the city of Boulder in this blue, this was their spending after they analyzed their budget the very first year. And you can see the majority of their spending was going towards quartile 1. That's a great sign. That means you're funding the program, or they're funding the programs that have the greatest impact on results. And here in quartile 2, a great degree of spending as well, with some in quartile 3 and here a little bit in quartile 4. But what you see in green, this represents the changes over the last 7 years and soon to be 8 years, where they have focused all new resource allocation on growing the programs that have the greatest degree of impact on results. That's a great thing to do. They are not uniformly increasing all programs equally, but instead really focusing on those programs that have the greatest degree of influence on results. So you can see tremendous growth in quartile 1 programs. These are new programs that they've started that they weren't providing in the past. New programs get run through the evaluation criteria, and they decide if the program has merit, meaning it has impact on results, we're going to start that program. Or these are increases to current programs that are also demonstrating a high degree of influence overall. They also grew quartile 2. That's a great thing. Quartile 2 programs also have a high degree of influence. You'll notice they also grew quartile 3 programs, at least to some degree. And you might ask yourself, why would you do that? These are programs that have less to do with achieving results overall. Why would we increase funding? Well, in Boulder, they had a very specific rule. They said, we can increase funding for lower priority programs if and only if those programs come with grant resources or the users of those programs are willing to pay a fee to pay specifically for the benefit of those programs. That's a great policy around some of your lower priority programs overall. And then finally, as you see down here in quartile 4, what they've been able to do is systematically mine away their investment of resources into programs that have less to do with results. These are programs that they've stopped doing. They are also programs where they took the employees who served on those programs and reallocated them to fill vacancies or fill the needs for staffing increases among their quartile 1 and quartile 2 programs. So this is what it looks like over the years. And in Boulder, it is their methodology to reallocate from within year upon year upon year. And so I thought I would share those stories as just a prelude of what's to come. There are even more motivations for getting into priority-based budgeting. We were just talking with Duluth, Minnesota earlier this morning. They unfortunately are dealing with a situation where they have less revenues coming in. So certainly that is another motivation. But as you start to roll out your implementation, and certainly as you get to the end, we will continue to bring this education and guidance to your departments in terms of how they can put the data to use. Well, shifting gears, I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about methodology, the steps that are before you in terms of how the process comes together and what we'll be working on with staff over your implementation period. Priority-based budgeting is actually quite simple. The ingredients are what you see on the screen. First and foremost, we have to have some idea of what your organization is trying to accomplish. Why do you provide any of the programs that you provide overall? What is your role as a local government service providing entity in your community? We call those results. These are the things that you're trying to achieve. I'll have a few slides on what results look like here in just a moment. Secondly, we take a look back inward towards your organization and say, well, what is it exactly that you do? What are the programs and services that you currently provide? And part and parcel with that question is, how much do those services cost? Do we know? Can we allocate our budget around those programs and services? Third, taking the results we're trying to achieve and the programs that we provide, we simply ask, how do these programs link to results? And it's an evaluation step. I'll describe how that evaluation takes place, but essentially that's how we get to the quartile evaluation is programs are scored relative to the results you're trying to accomplish. And finally, this all becomes integrated into your budget process, into the very process of resource allocation. So if you just keep this in mind, we are trying to address 3 basic questions throughout PBB. That's it. Why are we here? Why are we in business? What is it that we do, and how much does it cost us to do what we do? Or in the priority-based budgeting vocabulary, what are the programs that we provide? What are the costs of each of those programs, for which we go through a cost allocation step? And finally, how do those programs align or score with the results that we're trying to achieve? If you just keep this in your mind, this is the entirety of PBB, and this will be the core methodology that we walk through, is building each of these pieces of data for your organization. So I want to walk through each of these steps just briefly, starting with this idea of results and answering the question, why are we in business? And what you're looking at on the screen is illustrative. These are the types of results that we tend to see when we ask our communities, why are we in business? What are we trying to achieve? What are your results? Our communities answer, that one of the reasons they might be in business is to provide programs that increase economic health or economic vitality. But not all of our organizations say that that is true. We have had a couple who said that it is absolutely not local government's role to provide programs that increase economic vitality. That's why it's very important to ask the question. We're going to try to find out what are your results specific to your community overall. Most of our communities believe that they have a role in providing for a safe community or the safety and well-being of its citizens. Sustainable and maintained development is another example of a result that we frequently see. Effective transportation, health and well-being of citizens, culture and recreation, and so on and so forth. These 9 that you see over here on the left-hand side of the screen that are in this teal color are what we call community-oriented results. It's one nuance of priority-based budgeting is you have 2 different types of results, where community-oriented results help us understand why we offer programs directly to the community, why we offer programs for the benefit of our citizens, visitors to our community, or the businesses that are established in our community. So with community-oriented results, and for some of your departments, they will offer community-oriented programs that serve the citizens directly. As differentiated from these 3 types of results that you see over on the right-hand side in gold, these are examples of the results of what we call governance. Governance is the answer to the question, why do we offer internal programs that help the organization run more smoothly? And it's to achieve results like providing for financial stewardship or stewardship of all of your resources, not just financial. You might have stewardship of your human resources or your physical resources overall. The degree to which programs provide for a high-quality workforce, or the degree to which your programs help you maintain your regulatory compliance. They keep the organization out of trouble from a regulatory perspective. So we'll have 2 separate PBB evaluations going down the track at the same time. Community-oriented programs scored against community results and governance programs scored against the internal results of governance. Well, taking one step deeper from the result level, we actually drill down one level to actually say, if we're talking, for instance, about a safe and secure community, what exactly does that mean? How would we measure it? How would we know that we are being successful? What are the indicators of success? Or finally, in our language, what are the result definitions? So for every one of your results, we will work to create what we call result definitions, which are a comprehensive set of indicators or ways how that result is achieved. If I took safe and secure community as an example, you see here things that are logical to you. If I can demonstrate that my program helps us prepare to respond to emergencies, that is a acceptable definition for this community for proving that the program influences a safe and secure community. Enforcing the law, reducing crime, or protecting property. If my program helps us ensure that the air is safe to breathe and we have access to safe drinking water, that is a legitimate result definition. And so we will work our way through every single one of your results, creating these definitions against which you can measure your progress, and this will be used as a communication framework as departments try to prove that their programs are influencing any one or number of these results overall. One of the really interesting things as you get into this work is that we will also be sharing with you our database of all of the ways other communities have come up with their result definitions. So when you think about it, this could be quite fascinating for you all as elected officials. When you take something like a safe and secure community or economic vitality, these are big picture concepts. But when you can drill into how all the other communities have defined success in those arenas, perhaps you can learn from some of their examples as you then go to craft your own specific to Grand Prairie. So we'll be sharing the vast resources from all of the communities who have gone before you just to provide context in this result and result definition phase. The next component of the methodology is developing this inventory of programs and services. And I thought I'd just give you some examples of what this might look like. The program and service inventory is a step deeper than just understanding your departments, the divisions within departments, or your standard organizational structure. We're really trying to understand what are all the things that your departments provide And it becomes really quite interesting because in local government, you are a complex business, oftentimes providing hundreds of services to your residents and internally. What I'm demonstrating on the screen right now is illustrative of what we would see within a finance department. You take a typical finance department and they have an accounting division, maybe an administration division, and one level down from that is the program level where typically they offer something around accounts payable or accounts receivable. They provide internal controls or investment or payroll processing. That's a very important program. They provide for the budget process, financial reporting, or maybe pension administration. This is the program level. And you'll be asking yourselves throughout the process together, what's too big or what's too small? And we will continue to provide guidance and feedback to the departments as they're coming up with their program inventories. But ultimately, the answer to that question depends on the story and the narrative that you're trying to create. We have had some organizations who identify programs that are exceptionally small that you might wonder, they're crazy for identifying a program so small. We had one in Clark County, Washington, for example, that only had 0.02 FTE supporting the program. That's 2% of somebody's time in a given year. The program was strategic planning. And the reason that they defined the program, even though it was so tiny, was because from a staff level perspective, they were used to hearing from their elected officials that they weren't doing enough when it came to strategic planning within the organization. And staff wanted to demonstrate back to the elected officials that they heard them loud and clear, but that they were only able to allocate about 0.02 FTE to support that program. So you already understand they were going to try to use the process to have a healthy discussion around increasing support or workforce for that particular strategic planning function. So we'll be having this dialogue back and forth with departments on what's too big and what's too small, really trying to get to a sweet spot for the program inventory that you develop. And again, just like having all of the data available from the results and definitions of all other communities, we will also be working with your departments and sharing from the vast resources of program inventory examples from our database. When it comes down to a finance department or an IT department or engineering or public works or police or fire, or the city manager's office, we've seen 180 of them and then some. And while this will be tremendously helpful for the departments, this will also ease some of their workload as they come up with this, being able to look at other examples of program inventories from other communities. Rest assured, you will clearly come up with your own specific programs that are unique to Grande Prairie. We see it all the time. In fact, within our organization, we constantly marvel at the uniqueness of local government. We had Beaumont, Alberta, not too far from you, was the first and only community to identify Taco Tuesdays. They provide a Taco Tuesday program within the town of Beaumont, and we have just not seen that at all in the database. Pacifica, California, on the west coast of California, they offer beached whale removal. Again, a program that we doubt we will come across in Grande Prairie, but just to illustrate the point, every community has their unique programs as well. So while our initial program inventory database will help the departments tremendously, we will also be working with them to make sure that they're identifying the unique programs of the city of Grande Prairie. Well, from the inventory of programs to the costing of programs is actually pretty simple. We're going to take your budget, your entire line item budget, what you're used to, and cost allocate it or translate it around the programs that you provide to create a program budget. So everything will ultimately tie out. It will just be expressed in a new way. And the key differentiations that we make, first off, is the differentiation between your more ongoing operational line item expenses that are of a personnel nature and non-personnel nature. We're going to isolate those costs as differentiated from your one-time costs that can be more capital project oriented. And we'll take the ongoing costs, and those are what we're going to associate with the programs in your program inventory, while we will also be tracking all of your one-time costs, and you can prioritize your capital projects the exact same way as you prioritize your program inventory. But I want to just give you a quick look at what this looks like in the end. This is an example of a program where we're going to demonstrate the line item budget expressed now around a program. And the program is residential permits. the city was Toledo, Ohio. This is a real story. For the residential permit program, you can see by the time that they went through the cost allocation step, these are all of the people, the personnel who serve the residential permits program. So here's a plans examiner, here's a permit technician, a clerk specialist 1, clerk specialist 2, chief building official, and so on. And the way that we get the costs associated with this program, here you can see a clerk specialist 1 is about a half FTE dedicated to this program. Whereas down here, here's a secretary 3, where about 12% of their time goes to this program. That's exactly how we'll go through allocation. Each staff member allocates their time, and therefore we can calculate that percentage of their overall personnel costs rolls up to the program level. Over here, we have the non-personnel costs, things for office supplies, postage, the component of the print shop operation that also goes through residential permits. And the reason I bring this story to light is, as a quick example, you see this line going out the door for residential permits. The total program was $291,000, and it was a quartile 1 program. And I already told you earlier that quartile 1 means that the program is very influential towards the results that you're trying to achieve. And so from the elected officials' perspective, they asked the staff in Toledo, well, if it's a quartile 1 program, really important to our results, why do we have lines going out the door? Do we need to staff up for this program so we can handle the workload? And furthermore, are we charging enough? This seems to be a program that brings in its own fees, its own program revenues. Maybe we need to increase the fees for this program so we can staff up and cut down on these wait times. So they probed it a little bit further. And over here on the left-hand side, you see again, here's residential permits, the program, $291,000, as we just demonstrated on the last slide. And over here, this very tall bar, that reads program revenue. This was the measurement of all the fees and charges for service. And this was $652,000, well above the cost of providing the program overall. So again, from the elected officials' perspective, they said, we're making so much money, we're charging more than enough to provide for the cost of doing business. Why don't we use some of this revenue to cut down on the wait times for the residential permit program? And the answer was, over here on the right-hand side, here is the program commercial inspections. The program is $477,000, of which the program revenues, the fees coming in, are a paltry $4,180, almost entirely subsidized. And as you can guess, from staff's perspective, they were taking the profit from residential permits and actually using it to subsidize or offset the cost for commercial inspections. And the reason they were doing it was because from staff's perspective, they thought they were hearing council say, we want to make things easy on our local businesses. We want to make the cost of doing business in our community at a bare minimum. And this is what staff took and implemented within the organization. So this is the kind of data that will come to life for you. It's not to say Toledo is right or wrong in the situation, but now they can actually have the conversation back and forth with elected officials and have a rational discussion around fees and true cost of doing business for the other businesses in their community. You can take these costs, and I'll just show you one more example. Here's pothole repair in one particular community, and also compare them across our entire database for things like benchmarking. If this is something that is of interest to you, here we're demonstrating the cost of pothole repair across many of our communities in the database as a whole. At the summit that Bob mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we had a lengthy discussion around the pros and cons of benchmarking, the limits and the benefits as well. But one of the major takeaways was for you all as elected officials, when you're thinking about a new program that you might start, how nice would it be to query the database and say, well, how much is this program costing other communities? Are they charging a fee for the program that you're about to start? How does that program typically relate to results like economic vitality? Is it really having the impact that we think it's going to have? This is the kind of data that can come to life as you simply develop the program inventory and the cost of providing those programs. But there's one more step that I'll walk us through, and that is the evaluation of programs relative to results. And there are two components that I'm highlighting on the title slide, program scoring and what we call peer review. The departments themselves will go through a self-assessment. They will score their own programs first. And that will be followed by a peer review step that adds quality control overall to the process and allows for some thoughtful discussion and debate around the impacts that the programs presumably have from the department's perspective. So I'll show you a quick example just to demonstrate how this works. Let's pretend that these were your results: a safe and secure community, economic vitality, effective transportation and mobility, culture and recreation options, and the health and well-being of your community. And for each of your results, you had defined them just like you see in the result map on the screen. And if we took a program like snow removal and we asked ourselves, well, how does snow removal impact a safe and secure community? The way the departments will go through scoring is they'll take a look at every single one of these definitions and ask themselves, well, does snow removal help us prepare to respond to emergencies? And the answer is probably yes. How about enforcing the law? Does snow removal help us enforce the law? The answer to that is probably no. Does it help us reduce crime? Probably not. Does it help us protect property? Yes, I think the answer is yes. And they do that for every result and every definition until you gain a sense for all the linkages, all the ways that this particular program, snow removal, impacts every single one of your results. It's not tying snow removal to one result or another result. We want to see the cumulative impact that this program has on every result that you're trying to achieve. And as you see here, this is just illustrating a thought process. If I was providing the snow removal program, I would start to realize quickly this program has a lot of influence on a safe and secure community. It has a tremendous degree of influence on economic vitality. It's absolutely a transportation-oriented program, and so on and so forth. Well, in the scoring process itself, we translate this to a numeric scale simply to communicate that degree of influence. The scale reads 0 to 4, where a 3 or a 4 means that the program has a tremendous influence on the result. It had a lot of yellow highlight, in other words, in this example. A 1 or a 2 means that the program has some degree of influence on achieving the result, but not a tremendous degree, and 0 is no influence whatsoever. So you can see from the thought process we just went through, we're making this tie between snow removal and each of the results, where it has a tremendous degree of influence on safe and secure community, a lot of yellow here, a high score for economic vitality, effective transportation and mobility. It only got a 1 for culture and recreation options. As you can see here, snow removal is not having the greatest degree of influence on increasing culture and recreation opportunities, except for keeping your parks and trails and open spaces accessible, and that's a legitimate case. And it had something to do with the health and well-being of your community. Every program is scored this way across the organization, and that's how we gain this insight as to the link between programs that you provide and the results you're trying to accomplish. Following the departmental self-assessment, there is a peer review step. And in peer review, we're going to help design teams around each one of your results. So you might have a safe community result, a strong economy result, environmental sustainability, and so on. And the teams are cross-departmental. They are going to be made up of people who have the least likelihood of reviewing their own program, and therefore they get to ask questions about causality. Why do we believe that snow removal really does have an impact on economic vitality? How many times does it snow here? How many events were we able to respond to the emergency situation and allow people to get to work, and so on and so forth? It's really a great opportunity to bring consistency to those scores overall. And the reason I'm bringing this slide up as I talk about peer review is that it's not results alone that account for all of the scoring criteria, all of the reasons why you provide a program. But if you notice down here, there are additional scoring criteria in addition to results that also account for why you might provide programs, such as maybe the program's mandated by the federal government, or maybe the program's mandated by the province. And that is a good reason why you provide the program. So degree of mandate is yet another scoring criteria. Degree of reliance. Do your citizens rely upon you as a service providing entity for the benefit of the program? Or can they turn to the private sector? Can they turn to another public sector entity to receive the same benefit? Degree of reliance is another of what we call these basic program attributes. Cost recovery, overall change in demand, and population served round out these basic program attributes. So for every program that you provide, you will know its overall influence on results. You'll know how it qualifies for these basic program attributes, and you'll know its cost. You will basically know everything that you could know about the programs that you are providing. And that's how we finally venture into summarizing the PBB process and prioritizing programs. Those that score the highest are what we call quartile 1 programs, like I was demonstrating with the City of Boulder. The way that we get there, those are the programs that score the highest on basic program attributes, and they have the greatest degree of impact on your results. It's not like someone just puts a program into quartile 1 or chooses to put a program into quartile 4. It's an outcome of this scoring evaluation. So we'll perform the analysis, qualify your highest ranking quartile 1 community programs, your quartile 2 programs, which as you can see have a tremendous degree of influence on results, quartile 3 programs, and ultimately quartile 4. And the point of this is not to somehow get to the end and say, hey, great, here are all the quartile 4 programs, we can cut them tomorrow. In fact, cutting a program is pretty much the last resort. We will spend a lot of time working with departments to understand, even if you have a program that is of a quartile 3 or quartile 4 nature, what are the different ways that you could provide it? Could you charge a fee for providing the program? Could we get a grant to help offset some of the costs of providing the program? Could we do like Toledo did and seek a partnership so that we can create an efficiency and lower our investment into a lower priority program overall? We're going to explore and turn over every rock looking for opportunities to do something differently for especially the lower priority programs so that we can free up resources and channel them towards your higher priority endeavors overall. What you're looking at here, you have quartile 1 through 4 on the community side, quartile 1 through 4 on the governance side, and then everything comes together where we can say, well, how much are we spending overall on our quartile 1 versus quartile 2, quartile 3, and ultimately quartile 4 programs. You will have your spending array when you come to the end of your first year, and the name of the game from there will be how can you encourage the departments to begin to look at their investments differently, begin to look for resource reallocation opportunities, and ultimately present a recommended budget back to you that begins to demonstrate their march forward in terms of resource reallocation. The last thing that I'll do, I wanted to toggle away from the slides here for just a second and actually show you a quick look into the world of Strathcona County. I don't want to do a very long demo here, but just want to give you a sense for where this goes. So we will zoom in to Strathcona here. And I wanted to show you a couple things. First, we touched on this idea of differentiating the programs in terms of those that serve the community directly versus those that are more internal, community-oriented programs versus governance programs. And one thing that is going to be really cool for you is understanding where your resources are being invested in terms of those that are serving citizens directly. In Strathcona County's case, that's about 80% versus about 20% on those programs that are more internal in nature. And that's across the entire organization. We can toggle to look specifically within their general fund, where the proportion was about 75% for community-oriented and about 25% for their internal governance programs. And we can see the departments who make up that percentage of spending overall. When it comes to results, another pertinent question is, well, how much are we spending to achieve each and every one of those results? And in Strathcona County's case, you can see from their operational excellence results to infrastructure to a safe community to their social well-being results and ultimately economic vitality. This dark blue bar represents the spending on programs that have the highest degree of investment. And what Strathcona is able to do today is question this, thoughtfully question, are we doing enough to invest in the health and well-being of our local economy? And if we want to drill into it, we can choose any of our results, in this case, healthy local economy, understand the departments who are providing the programs to achieve that result, and drill down even further to see each and every one of those programs that has an impact on that result so that you all can say, here's what we're doing today, and we can ask the question, what could we be doing tomorrow or next year or in the next 5 years to really move the needle in terms of achieving each and every one of the results you're in business to provide. And finally, again, getting back to the resource alignment, the quartile perspective, what the departments will be digging into is their specific spending arrays, trying to understand where they have the opportunities to reallocate from low priority to high priority overall. This is filterable by any of your accounting funds, any of your specific departments, any division within the departments, and ultimately gaining a perspective in terms of programs that are receiving grant dollars or programmatic revenue, or pulling those fees out of the equation to just look at the subsidized element of your programs overall as well. The very last thing I'll show you, because it's just kind of very interesting, and then I promise we'll take a break and entertain some questions. You remember we had these basic program attributes, degree of mandate, degree of reliance, cost recovery, and so on. And these become really interesting to filter on as the departments are looking for opportunities. For instance, if we wanted to only look at the things that we do that we're mandated to do, I can move the filter to mandate equals 4, which if you could read this down here in small font, I'm sure on your screen, it says these are the programs that we're required to do by a higher level of government than ourselves, the federal government or the provincial government. And as I come up to the top, I can see here in Strathcona County that many of these programs are quartile 1 or quartile 2, meaning not only are they mandated, but they're also achieving results to a high degree. But as I get to quartile 3 or even a handful of programs here in quartile 4, this is counterintuitive. These are programs that, yes, we're mandated to provide, but these have less to do with achieving results. In other words, yes, we're required to do them, but we kind of wish that we weren't required to do them because they have little impact on the results that we're trying to achieve. And priority-based budgeting communities are able to dig into these programs and ask, well, what does the mandate say? What is the requirement that we think we need to follow? Do we have any flexibility in terms of the level of service that we provide in order to meet the standard that has been set forth, the mandate that is required of us, again, for these lower priority programs? For quartile 1 and quartile 2, yes, it's mandated, but even if it wasn't, we'd probably want to be providing those programs anyway because they have a high degree of impact overall on our results. So again, this will be something that we train the departments how to do. We could look at the other end of the spectrum and say, let's not worry about the programs that are highly mandated. Let's only look at those that scored 0, 1, or 2, meaning either they're not mandated at all, or at best, they're mandated to the degree that it's your own board policy, your own local policy, an ordinance, a resolution, something that you have the power to change. These programs are not mandated by a higher level of government, and this becomes really interesting too. If they're quartile 1 and quartile 2, you might say, hey, that's fantastic. It's like a report card. Your own policies are in alignment with the results you're trying to achieve. However, if it's quartile 3 or quartile 4, a little bit different conversation on the table. For these programs, you're doing them because your own internal policies require you to do them. But if they're scoring in quartile 3 or quartile 4, you might ask yourself, maybe our policies are outdated. And that's exactly where PBB communities go to explore for this filter on the programs. We're required to do them by our own policies. They have less to do with achieving results. Is it possible that we can advocate for a change in our own internal policy and therefore free up our ability to reallocate these resources elsewhere? I could go on and on to demonstrate more filters in the tool, but I know we're coming up close on the hour, and I did want to certainly make some time for some questions. Bob, I might turn it back to you just to see, are there any questions in the room or anything I can help address or anything specifically that you'd like me to demonstrate more of?
Sure. Thanks very much, Chris. This is Mayor Bill here. I'll just ask my council colleagues if there are any questions for Chris, so you can direct them. Well, we can do the typical ring in. I think, Chris, you should be able to hear us when council members' microphones come on. We have Councillor Jackie Clayton with a question.
Thanks for the information, Chris.
Councillor Clayton, just make sure your microphone's closed because for
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks
can hear
for the information. I had a question in regards to sort of process. How many variables or how much sort of deviation from, for example, when you brought up the snow removal question and you run it through the sort of grid, there was a couple questions that you, for example, said, yes to or no to, and I was choosing the other answer. And so I'm curious how many variables come into play when you're sort of running things through the system?
I agree. This is such a fast example. Intuitively, this is an example where you might say, yes, snow removal is helping us respond to emergencies. This is the logic that the department might have used. But certainly, if you are participating, if you're on the peer review team and you see the department scored itself a 4 for safe community based on meeting these definitions, your opportunity in peer review is to say, I don't get it. Can you bring to bear some information? Can you enlighten our team? Do you have any metrics? Why do you believe that your program has such a high degree of influence on this result based on the definitions that we've agreed to? And so that's where the rubber hits the road. The department may feel strongly about it, but ultimately peer review has their say, and they get to ask questions as well. And there are programmatic scoring changes that take place as a result of peer review.
Great, thanks.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay.
Any other questions, Council? Maybe while others are considering, Chris, this is Mayor Bill. For communities that have approached this before, what's the typical timeline for do communities that approach this approach it in a multi-year budget environment? And if they do they set targets for change in the first year after implementation, or is it over the course of a couple of years? Like what's a reasonable expectation from, okay, we've implemented a new priority-based budgeting approach, and when would you expect to see sort of the significant or demonstrable changes?
Very good. I'll use Boulder's slide here for an example. First and foremost, some of our communities, when they get into this work, they have a massive budget shortfall to deal with right away. Cincinnati, Ohio had over $100 million budget shortfall in their general fund, and so they had to make $100 million worth of changes right away. So they were forced to because they just didn't have the resources, and they had to figure out a way to balance the budget. Absent a budget crisis, then it becomes really interesting because the question before you is, or any of our communities, what is driving your change? Most often, like the Kalamazoo story, where they have a new compelling result, like ending generational poverty, the driver is going to be, what new programs do we want to start, or what programs do we offer today that we wish we could do more of to really make a dramatic impact on the results we're trying to achieve, which then begs the question, from where are you going to get the resources to start those new programs or to increase funding for the programs that you currently offer? And that's what is going to drive the context for why departments are making changes to their resource allocation. So it is kind of interesting to us. Depending on your circumstances, you could have widely varying amounts of resource reallocation take place in your very first year. If it turns out that you are kind of under a financial crunch, that's where we're going to see just more of a dramatic need to make changes. However, if you're not, then the question will be, well, what will move you from status quo? How can we start to push the organization to reconsider thoughtfully where they can reallocate from low priority to high? As you see in Boulder's case, I mean, this is over 7 years of doing this. It's tremendous to see this amount of growth. But what I'll also point your attention to, it's not as if they eliminated all of quartile 4 or even all of quartile 3. They even increased some of their quartile 3 programs. But this has been Boulder's trajectory because they have had ample new resources over the years, and they've just wanted to make sure that all of those are focused on the highest priority possibilities.
Thanks, Chris. So, Mayor Bill again. So, have you seen communities then set, or is it commonplace, I guess, for communities using priority-based budgeting to set targets for percentage of, percentage of spending allocated by quartile? Like, do communities,
Sure.
do they say we want, 60% of spending to be on quartile 1 programs, 20% on quartile 2, and so on?
Sure. I'll explain. That's not a bad idea at all. That's a absolutely legitimate way to tackle it. What we've seen more of, however, is communities will say, okay, here's our starting place, and maybe I'll not use boulders. Let's just pretend it was this example here towards the end. The first question before you will be, is it a status quo budget, or do you have new resources to allocate, or are you trying, to reduce the budget overall? You will need that initial goal line of what are the resources that you have. And then what we typically see is, okay, if overall, for all of the money that we have, we can afford, let's say, a 3% increase, one way, not the right way, but an across-the-board increase would allow for a 3% increase at the quartile 1 level, 3% increase at the quartile 2, 3% at quartile 3, and 3% increase at quartile 4. That would achieve an overall across-the-board 3% increase. But what you can use the tool to do is say, well, let's not do across the board. Let's say we don't want to increase quartile 3. We're going to hold that at 0%. We actually want to decrease quartile 4. You can apply a target of a minus 5% resource reduction to quartile 4 programs, thereby allowing you to increase quartile 1 and quartile 2 at much higher levels than 3%, really driving not only a way to just balance the budget, but to churn through resources within, even given only a 3% increase. And what I find, not just me, but elected officials, department heads, city managers, and other organizations, they have reflected this. They said in local government, what's so hard is that when you're only used to incremental changes from one year to the next, maybe you get a 3% increase this year, maybe it's 2% the next year. It's usually not the case where you have a 10% increase in revenue unless you're just a dramatically growing community. And even that, it's just not happening every single year. So how do you make those gains? How do you really get the substantial new amounts of resources to start really bold new programs or increase funding for great programs that you currently provide? And the best way to do it is to reallocate from within. But your target idea makes a lot of sense. We do see a lot of communities establishing targets at the quartile level as they ask the departments to make a recommended, a budget recommendation from one year to the next using targets.
Thank you. I see Councillor Bressie, Councillor Dylan Bressie.
Thank you. The data nerd in me absolutely loves this and is excited about it. One thing I'm curious, though, is about organization nimbleness, where you have stories or examples of where the priorities in an organization change, either the economic conditions change dramatically, or there's an election and a new elected body that's got drastically different priorities. And how does the system allow for pivoting? Do you have to basically tear down the whole thing and redo it if you get new priorities in a community? Or just tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, great question. We wondered the same thing when we first started. And one of our realizations over the years is that when you look at these kind of results, it's unlikely that a community is going to say, hey, we were in the business of providing for a safe and secure community in the past, but we're not about a safe and secure community anymore. Or economic vitality was important to us in the past, but we're no longer going to be concerned about the local economic health. In other words, we tend to see stability at the result level. Sometimes you will definitely see a new result introduced, but oftentimes once you define what is your role as a local government service provider, we see the result areas tend to be pretty stable. However, there are two other areas where these kind of changes that you're speaking of can be reflected really well. One is we can apply a result weighting factor. For instance, you might decide this upcoming year, never before has it been so important for Grande Prairie to really focus on economic vitality. you want to focus on job creation, and you want to focus on employment and business retention and expansion. So we can apply a weighting factor to your results, provide you an exercise, rather, to apply these weighting factors. And that will mean that when it comes to scoring, if my program actually can demonstrate a high degree of impact on economic vitality, it gets a boost in its overall score because that result matters more according to the algorithm. So that's one way, applying these weighting factors to emphasize that some results might be more important than others in any given year. Yet another way is to dig into these definitions. So there might be something new that you learn in terms of the issues that you're facing driving a safe and secure community. Not many people predicted the opioid epidemic, or what happens when we start talking about driverless cars and their impact overall on these results. You can really spend time focusing on these definitions to make sure that they're clear and comprehensive, allowing for all the ways that programs describe their influence on results, and that tends to be helpful. But all of this kind of full circle, even when we see almost like a complete transformation at the council level or at the elected official level from one party affiliation to another party, it does not lead to the kind of effect where a program that used to have nothing to do with achieving results and was quartile 4 is now all of a sudden quartile 1, or a program that used to have everything to do with achieving results and was quartile 1 now goes to quartile 4. We don't see that. And I think the reasons are becoming clear to you. It's because we do have that stability at the result level. It's just that you can emphasize the importance of results from one year to the next, and certainly tinker with the ways that those results are defined to always make sure that they're relevant for the circumstance that you're facing in any given year.
Okay. Chris, I don't see anybody else with any questions. Last opportunity, Council. Well, I think you've given us a lot to mull over, given us I'll speak on my own behalf, given me a much better understanding of priority-based budgeting. I may have a little Dylan Bressy data nerd in me because I'm certainly excited about this. And it looks like there's a lot of ability for us to really target what's meaningful to our community. I think in the end, that's what it's about. And certainly you've presented it that way very much, Chris, so thank you very much for that. Bob, do you have any last comments?
Yeah, I'll just thank you as well, Chris. That was exactly what we had hoped to do. I would dare say that council members now know more about priority-based budgeting than anybody would ever want to know, data nerds notwithstanding. But I'm really excited about this too, for a couple of reasons. Well, let me cite three. One is, I think, short-term financial control in a planning sense is crucially important to a successful organization. And I hear council members asking questions about short-term financial control. And I think this is the way that we're going to get at it. And we're going to get at it in a very fact-based way. Number two, this is a rallying point for the organization. So this is transitional for us. It's not entirely uncommon vis-a-vis what we've always done. We've had the citizen budget tool that is a priority gauging exercise. We've had the base service levels reviews, which have been looked at the relevance of programs and services in the organization and scored them and tried to compare them to other municipalities. So it's not radically new, but it's a rallying point in the organization. We've got the whole organization moving purposefully toward the adoption of a very powerful tool that will help us to communicate better with our council and better with our community. And the third is perhaps a bit more personal. When we talked about strategic planning and the strategic priorities that have been set for the council in the by the prior council in the prior four-year budget period, we talked about exploring new directions as being one of the focus areas. And within the definition of exploring new directions, we talked about innovation and best practices. And I was trying to point out just how much impact those kinds of directions have on an organization as we start to execute and the years go in and the years go out. This is an example of a innovation, a best practice that came about, I would dare say, because of the guiding principles and strategic focus areas of council. And it wasn't me. This was two people in the organization, Patricia Curtis and Susan Walker, who picked up on the relevance of this tool, saw what council was driving at as they were setting priorities and they were setting purpose for the organization, listened to the kind of questions that were coming up. And two people in our organization researched this, took the time to think about whether it would have relevance, took the time to think about whether or not it would have impact on moving forward. And those people brought it forward to my office and to CLT and started to get what we're now seeing as the adoption of PBB. That's really an important outcome of setting a strategic focus area that really encourages people to think outside the box and to start adopting innovative techniques that will make a difference in the organization. So, Chris, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. I don't see anybody else in the queue either, and I bet Council would like to take a break to stretch legs before we get into the next section of the budget presentation.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'll drop off the line, but just wanted to say I'm extremely thankful to have the opportunity to work together. So thank you for your time today, and look forward to having many more interactions throughout the implementation, and certainly as this all comes together. So thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. Okay, so council will take, I think in our book it had sort of said a half an hour. Well, we don't do anything in 5 minutes. We've proven that. Yeah. So let's aim for back at 3 o'clock. Okay, everybody, I think we're back, and we will continue on. Mr. City Manager, where are we headed next?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are moving now into the 2018 budget. And my intention for the duration of the afternoon will be to go through a high-level review of what occurred in the budget process, the budget deliberations that have gone on to this point. And they result in essentially 4 scenarios that we'll talk about. One is this arithmetic extrapolation of the 4th year of a 4-year budget. You'll see a number associated with that. We'll talk about how management would then move from that pure extrapolation down to a more managed number, which we call the base budget. And then we'll talk about how management would move down to the 3% budget and the 0 budget, which are the 2 scenarios that had been directed by City Council. And I'll do that at a relatively high level here. Feel free to interrupt if there are areas that you want more clarity. But generally, when I refer to changes that are being made in the infrastructure and protective services area in order to contribute to the $2 million net cost reduction that's necessary to get from point A to point B. Horacio will take us through a much more detailed discussion of what that's all about and how that happens. I just want to sort of lay the groundwork so that people are aware of what we'll go through tomorrow at the division level by each of the directors. So with that, Mr. Chairman, the first slide in the package itself is an organization chart. And this is something that Council had asked for, or several councillors had asked for, to make sure that they've got a sort of feel for where the FTEs, where the full-time equivalent personnel currently reside in the organization. And this is the total establishment for 2017-2018 is set at 651 positions. So at any given time, we may have materially more than this in terms of employees that are in the organization. They would typically be casuals or seasonal employees that would come and go as the seasons come and go. But the core organization is 651 people. About 318 of those are in what we now refer to as infrastructure and protective services. About 244 of them in community living. 65 in corporate services and the CFO's office, and about 24 associated with the city manager's office. So that's sort of the base of the organization. So we've got, relatively speaking, $160 to $170 million operating budget rolling through a 4-year cycle mapping against strategy, and about 651 people at the core that are trying to affect those decisions on a day-to-day basis throughout the community. Next slide is when I talk about the extrapolation of this 4-year budgeting cycle, what had happened in the preparation of a 4-year budget here in Grande Prairie is a bit different than what you may have seen in other multi-year budgeting scenarios, where we essentially locked a budget scenario in for a 4-year period and then map actual against that locked-in budget for the ensuing 4-year period. And so it results in us, what we were experiencing, for example, and when we're talking about variances that are being experienced in 2017, frequently you'll hear people speaking to causes of variances that go all the way back to assumptions that were being made in late 2014, early 2015 that gave rise to the budget, which is a very difficult explanation because a lot of people around the table even now weren't around the organization in 2014, 2015 to see those. But in any event, that's the framework that has been used in the city of Grande Prairie. And it essentially set a framework in place that said, given the view of the future that was evident for the 4-year budget cycle, the average annual tax rate increase that would be required to support the service levels in the community would be about 4.2% per year. So the budget, the 4-year budget, anticipated a 4.2% per year budget increase. That in the first year of the actual budget that got set in 2015, that 4.2% increase went down to a 3.69% increase, which essentially took what would have been a $4.8 million revenue generation that would have occurred, incremental revenue generation that would have occurred through that tax rate increase, and dropped it from 4.8 million down to 4.2 million. So 2015 saw us departing thoughtfully, but departing nonetheless from the 4-year budget cycle by setting a different tax rate and by recovering a different level of incremental revenue than was in the plan. By 2016, the economy was having its effect on residents in our community, and council again responded. Didn't believe at the time that a 4.2% planned tax rate increase would be appropriate for 2016, and so that tax rate increase was dropped from a planned 4.2% down to 2.25%. So the effect of that is what would have been an incremental $4.8 million in tax-generated revenue in that year turned out to be $2.5 million. And again, in 2017, the planned 4.2% tax rate increase was reset down to 0.51%. So 2017, the tax rate increase that was administered in Grande Prairie was 0.51%. The result of that is that what would have been a targeted $10 million in new tax revenue over that period now would need, if you were going to try and correct to that and get back to the full amount of revenue that would have been anticipated in the 4-year budget, you would have to generate $6.8 million worth of new tax revenue in a single year. And that would reset the 4-year budget cycle so that you did what you intended to do in the first place. Of course, that's not something that anybody would ever do. Every year, the expenses were adjusted against that decline in revenue as well. But if you're looking at the 4-year budget cycle, that's what would have been required. So the point where we look at a pure mathematical extrapolation of the 4-year budget cycle leaves us in a position where we start from having to depart from a $6.8 million revenue shortfall as compared to the budget framework that's been in place for the 4-year budget cycle. Next slide then starts to look at how we're going to do that, or what the effects of this, what we're referring to as a revenue shortfall, is going forward. So the initial budget, the pure arithmetic extrapolation, is $6.8 million revenue shortfall. The base budget that management achieved, and we'll talk about how we got from point A to point B, but the base budget that we brought forward to recommend reduces that shortfall by $2 million. So it takes it from a $6.8 million shortfall down to a $4.8 million shortfall, which could be balanced by a 4.2% tax rate increase in a single year. The next level that we'll go through as the slides continue is the 3% target, which is a 3.4% shortfall. So moving from a $6.8 million shortfall down to a $3.4 million shortfall requires a net revenue reduction of $3.4 million. That is achieved in target, what we refer to as target 1, and that $3 million or $3.4 million shortfall then could be balanced, and a balanced budget achieved with a 3% tax increase. And the final scenario is the 0 scenario, so that would take the initial $6.8 million and remove all of that, so find net revenue or net cost solutions that would eliminate the full $6.8 million shortfall in a single year, and that would result in a 0 tax increase for 2018. So that's what we'll go through as we look at the scenarios. We'll make less and less reference to the $6.8 million shortfall because really it's quite theoretical. We'll focus then on the $4.8 million shortfall, the $3.4 million shortfall, and the 0 shortfall. Next slide then takes us to what we're referring to as the arithmetic extrapolation down to the base budget. And I'll just outline at a high level what we did in order to take that $2 million out of the picture. In fact, on the next slide, you'll see how that budget balances against a required tax rate increase of 4.2%. So we start out with the $6.8 million shortfall. We end up, after the adjustments, at the $4.8 million shortfall. And essentially, what has occurred in the interim are a series of management changes that have reduced net $2 million out of the budget. We call them a combination of favorable economic adjustments, departmental cuts and reductions, and unfavorable economic adjustments. The favorable economic adjustments include things like operational efficiencies, realignment of personnel and realignment of people through the organization, revenue solutions. So one of the things that we have placed into the budget as a base level of assumption is one that we are going to have to stand accountable for as we move forward. And that is, as we went through the fees and charges for the City of Grande Prairie en masse, we found several instances where, as I pointed out earlier, we had fees and charges that hadn't been changed in 10 years, hadn't been increased in 10 years. We also found several examples of fees and charges that are well out of market as compared to other mid-sized municipalities. And so what we've undertaken to do as a management group is to do a complete end-to-end review of fees and charges throughout the entire organization and bring back to council a recommendation about those fees and charges. In some cases, you might imagine fees and charges will go down. We've also heard, as I'm sure you've heard from the community, that there are some fees and charges that are administered through the organization that are too high. More likely, there are going to be increases associated with fees and charges that have not kept up with inflation and not been moved as they perhaps should have been moved on an annual basis to stay relatively making the same contribution that they had in the past. So we made an assumption that we would be able to deliver an effect of about 2.5% increase in the fees and charges, the revenue from fees and charges into the budget, and that would help to take us from this $6.8 million shortfall down to a $4.8 million shortfall. We also introduced a technique that we're referring to as managed manpower. And this one is one that I've actually used before and found some good success with it. It's a management protocol in which when natural attrition occurs in the organization, there is a required pause. So every time we have a natural attrition occur, somebody leaves because they want to go work somewhere else, or somebody retires, that we insert a gap of 2 months into the rehiring process. So we will live, in the times when attrition occurs, we'll live without a warm body in that seat for 2 months, which means the rest of the team has to shoulder up. We'll have to find other ways to make sure that service level quality does not reduce materially. We'll have to make sure that mandated positions are filled as they need to be filled. But generally speaking, whenever we have attrition occur, we will insert this protocol of managed manpower and create a gap. And that gap saves a significant amount of money in the organization and is a sustainable business practice that we feel we can commit to and do every year as the organization goes forward. We've also taken a portion of the municipal, the MSI grant and attributed it to operating budgets. It's available for operating budgets, but had not historically been used that way. So a portion of the solution was found through municipal MSI grant reallocation to operating. And as I pointed out earlier, a realignment of people to create higher levels of efficiencies and control within the corporation. We also went through a series of cuts and reductions in order to get down to those levels. And these are cuts and reductions that you will hear about in much more detail. But they were quite significant in order for us to get at the kind of revenue requirement that affords the community lower and lower tax rate increases than what would have otherwise fallen out of the budget. The first pass that takes us from the arithmetic extrapolation down to what we're calling base case saw about $1 million reduction in infrastructure and protective services, about $1 million reduction in corporate services, and about $1 million reduction in city manager community living, and about $1 million reduction in city manager and corporate services. through benefit savings and other austerity measures. So those contributed to taking us down closer to the 4.2. What we had to fight against was we're starting at this plateau of 6.8 million. We start to make cuts, but we have to also realize that the original base budget did more than just anticipate a 4.2% annual rate increase. It also anticipated a significant growth, annual growth in the assessment base, and that growth didn't occur. So the budget that we're looking at in 2018 is a budget that has a significantly lower assessment base than we had anticipated when we put the 4-year budget together. So that takes us, when we talk about unfavorable economic adjustments, that takes us in the other direction. We have a smaller tax base than what we thought we did. We also have significantly reduced base level sales revenue in a number of areas inside the organization. Virtually everywhere that we sell services, we found our sales affected, as many businesses in Grande Prairie have been affected by the economic conditions in the community. Transit revenues are down significantly. Planning and development fees are down significantly. Revolution Places revenues are down significantly, et cetera. And that has cost us the ability to correct quickly. We've already started in virtually all of those areas. Koji has started a marketing campaign that's intended to start restoring top-line sales revenue to levels that we've seen in the past. But in the base that we're sitting at entering into 2018, we have to recognize that that occurred. We also had the occurrence of the loss of, I would refer to it as the loss of confidence by our community in the way Eastlink Centre was being operated in 2017. We had at one time 6,000 members in the Eastlink Centre that were full members in the Eastlink Centre. We lost about half of those. Our spontaneous use dropped significantly. Our revenues associated with the Eastlink Centre dropped significantly. As Council is aware, we dropped from a spontaneous use availability of about 17 hours a day at one point, down to a spontaneous use availability of about 4 hours a day in the worst of the situation that occurred in 2017. We have corrected that. We're back up almost to the full 17 hours a day of spontaneous use now, and Koji can go through that in a lot more detail. We've corrected a lot of what occurred during that period, but we are now starting from a base where we need to recapture that top-line sales revenue. We need to recapture those members. We need to get people back in the Eastlink Centre and enjoying that facility. So that cost us a significant downward adjustment, just trying to recognize the fact that the top-line sales revenue had been radically affected in many areas. And I think a combination of the general economic conditions within Grande Prairie and the fact that in the case of Eastlink Centre, the organization, and when I say the organization, I do not mean the people at Eastlink Centre. They did a tremendous job of trying to keep the place afloat and keep the place working constructively in the community through the entire piece. The organization let Eastlink down. The manifestation of what occurred when we let Eastlink down was it impacted users, it impacted members, and the members and users responded. So we've corrected that now. We've put the kind of fail-safes in place that will ensure that that never happens again. And now it's our job to get those people back and confident using the facility again. So the combination of all of those kinds of initiatives, and you'll see those in more detail as the directors go through, took us from the $6.8 million revenue shortfall down to a revenue shortfall of $4.8 million. That budget can be balanced with a 4.2% tax rate increase in 2018. We continued then, arising from Council's direction to look at scenario budgeting. We continued then to take the base budget, what we would refer to as a base budget, down to target 1. And target 1 was the 3% tax rate increase, or in other words, an adjusted tax shortfall of $3.4 million. And this involved significant cuts again. We needed to take $1.4 million out of the operating budget in order to get down to a 3% balanced budget. And we continued to make cuts throughout the area, or net reductions throughout the area. Infrastructure and protective services, an additional cut of $631,000. City manager corporate services, $172,000. Community living, another $100,000. And an adjustment to the municipal provision for capital tax that reduces the capital tax assessment or capital tax collection by $500,000. And Susan will go through exactly what that means and how that occurs in the budget that you'll see tomorrow. But those kind of efforts collectively take us down. They achieve the $1.4 million net reduction. They take us down to a budget level that is capable of being balanced with a 3% tax increase, which was the objective of the exercise. We then continued on from target 1 to target 2, so moving from the $3.4 million adjusted tax shortfall down to a balanced budget with no tax increase. This required some deeper cuts and some deeper initiatives. By the way, I think I mentioned earlier this morning, and I'll just repeat it now, when management goes through these scenarios, we go through them in earnest, we go through them in all seriousness, and we are prepared. We do not recommend that you take these deep cuts, certainly not in a single year, but we are prepared to implement the scenarios that we're bringing forward to you today. These are not scenarios that talk about fighting every second fire. These are performing levels of service in the community that would be respectable levels of service. They're just not at the levels that we're used to as a community. So infrastructure and protective services, an additional cut of $1.265 million. This starts to affect things like snow removal, crime prevention, engineering services, inspection, environment, and even the RCMP in this case. Community living, an additional cut. The city manager corporate services, additional cuts of $174,000. Community living, additional cuts of $642,000, and an additional use of this reduction in capital tax of $1.3 million. And I will ask Susan to elaborate on how that works tomorrow. But here we start to see in things like community living pretty significant changes to the level of service in parks, Coca-Cola Center, Muskogee Park, Eastlink Center, community social development. If we're going to get at these levels of revenue and deploy them, they do require a fairly significant series of reductions. So when we talk about tax implications, that sort of fleshes out at a high level how management achieved both the base budget, the target 1, 3% budget, and target 2, 0% budget. Just to put those in perspective a little bit, if we looked at a assessment of an average house in Grande Prairie at $360,000, the 2017 municipal taxes would have been $3,454. Under the base budget, that would increase by $145 on the year. Under target 1, it would increase by $104 on the year. And of course, at target 2, where there's a 0% tax increase, it would not increase at all. Just a brief discussion on the 2018 capital budget. The first table that you see in your package is capital funding available as at December 2018. And what this is the reserves and sources of capital that we have to bring to bear on capital projects throughout the entire organization. And I won't go through them all. In fact, General Debenture I'll go through in a bit more detail on a subsequent slide. But they are typically a series of reserves that the municipality has maintained over the years, and they are used to fund capital programs. One of the things that management has undertaken to do in 2018 is a complete end-to-end review of the city's use of reserve funding. And so an obvious question when you see reserves of this nature and $185 million in capital sitting in reserves is that the right amount of reserves? Is that the right amount of money that should be sitting in reserves to meet purposes? Every one of these reserves is backed by a policy. So these are either in conformance or striving to become in conformance with the policies that gave rise to them. But there is an exercise, a financial exercise that can occur whereby we go through every single one of them and look at what the statistical likelihood is of an occurrence during which the funds are drawn from the reserve. What's the likelihood of simultaneous occurrences of those types of events, such that two reserves or more than two reserves might be drawn upon in the same year, and whether or not there is an opportunity for the City of Grande Prairie to optimize and thereby reduce the amount of capital that it has sitting in reserve. That's not done without consequence. These reserves all earn interest earnings, which have become part of the revenue that we talked about in the revenue budget. But they are an appropriation of money, of capital that is sitting in reserve, waiting for certain conditions to arise under which it will be used. So during 2018, we will look at this in a very rigorous fashion to determine whether we believe that these are the right numbers, collect both individually, policy by policy, reserve by reserve, and collectively for the entire organization, whether a organization with $170 million operating budget needs to have $185 million worth of reserves. So can't predict what the outcome of that exercise is. I know it has changed. The reserve balances have changed pretty radically in recent years, but that's something that we will go through in 2018 and be able to bring back to council. The next slide just talks about our debt and the current debt capacity of the organization. You heard from CIBC Wood Gundy this morning, their views on debt, and Dylan, you asked a very relevant question about whether or not this is an opportune time to borrow. We are at pretty responsible levels of debt right now. In 2015, we were at about 53% of our debt limit. And in 2018, we're predicted to be at 48% of it. So we've got some room. Debt is a dangerous tool, as you know, when unlike current revenue financed capital or sinking fund financed capital, once you've embarked on debt, you've got fixed payments now that need to be met every year, regardless of the economic circumstances of the community. So we don't take it lightly, but debt is also a very valuable term when you're building long-term assets. We're putting assets into this community that are going to last 30 and 40 years. There is no reason why today's taxpayers should be paying for the entire freight on an asset that's going to last for the next 30 years. Debt at low coupon rates is a pretty convenient way to match those who will use a facility over the next 30 years with those who will pay for the facility over that same period.
I see at least one council member. I may have missed another one that was in the queue. If the questions still are relevant, please come back in. But I see Councillor Palat is in the queue.
Thank you, Bill. It's a different environment to realize we can borrow money at 2.5% or 3% than what private industry is used to borrowing at. So I can totally respect that. Just on a long-term debt, maybe it's just because we haven't approved it at council, but I know at committee last week we basically approved $8.5 million of the debt for the Bear Creek pool and the grandstand. So is it just not reflected in here yet? I'm just wondering, because it's.
It is reflected, yes.
Okay, so that would be, we paid down some debt over that year plus added the $8.5 million on as well.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
See Councillor Clayton.
Thank you, Mayor Given. A question, sorry, I'm still processing a slide behind. The capital funding, the reserve list, and I don't need an answer right now, but I'm interested in the conversation of how things look if we borrow for capital assets such as fleet, as opposed to holding money in a reserve that we could be using on operational things to in turn reduce taxes. So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for somebody to provide that as an option.
Through the chair. Am I still on? Yes, through the chair. That's a very good point. And the obvious, when I talk about doing a reserve analysis, the obvious application of that analysis is this likelihood or propensity for simultaneous draws to occur at the same time and take us down below a balance. There are many, many other reasons for doing a robust review, and one of them is exactly that. Are we using reserves appropriately? Does an equipment reserve make sense in a environment in which our cost of capital is so low. One of the anomalies, and depending on who you talk to academically on this, when you get a lot of different schools of thought, but one of the anomalies in the municipal sector is that we have access to long-term debt at very, very low coupon rates, extraordinarily low because of our association with the province of Alberta. When we go to a taxpayer, though, when we look at a taxpayer's purse, the taxpayer's cost of capital is exceedingly high. It's typically, in my view, the appropriate number to use is the taxpayer's next marginal dollar of credit. So the assumed taxpayers are tapped out, and if they're going to experience another dollar of call, it will be at their marginal cost of credit, which could take them into an 18, 19, 20% cost of capital. So we have an opportunity for low-cost debt at 2.5%, 3%. The consumer is experiencing a 20% marginal cost of capital. So when we go through that kind of analysis, it's not quite that black and white to apply it, but we'll make sure that those principles are examined as well.
See Councillor Palat.
Thanks, Mayor Given. I guess just back to the 4-year tax revenue budget versus actual. I'm just trying to understand how we base the number off of. Like, are we looking at saying we think we're going to have so many new residential homes, we have so much square foot of industrial, so much for commercial? Just so I can understand, like, if we're looking at 18's potential revenue from what we don't have now, or 19 and beyond, if we're looking at a 4-year cycle, what the metric's been in the past, just so I can understand what we were using and maybe what we're going to be using with priority-based budgeting moving forward.
I can't really speak to what was done in the past in terms of setting out what the expectations were, but Susan can correct me if I'm wrong. There would have been a series of assumptions that went into building the 4-year budget, and they would have assumed a growth rate in residential new construction, commercial new construction, and even industrial construction that would have covered the entire 4-year period. And then that would have been the escalating tax base upon which the 4.2% tax rate increases would have been applied. What we found in looking at 2018 and reconciling it back to the original 4-year budget was we had about an $800,000 shortfall. So just the growth that didn't occur that was intended to have occurred put us into an $800,000 smaller assessment base than what we would have been in had that plan come to fruition.
Councillor Minhas.
Thank you, Bill Mayor. Well given. The question is 3% is fixed for 30 years or 40 years what we take, or it's 5-year term?
No, it's fixed for the entire duration of the debenture.
And the second one is, like Jackie asked, if we use a reserve, if we borrow against money in reserve, then that money is stuck, we can't use it, right?
That's correct.
So then it's not worth. Okay, thank you.
And the exercise will be we'll make sure that we have a very robust discussion about it when we're completed and before it's been finalized. We'll come back to council. But we had seen, just as a good example, the reserve that you're referring to, Jackie, the equipment reserve, in a previous situation in which I looked at the same type of a reserve, there is a mathematical formula that takes into account every single piece of equipment that's being consumed in our day-to-day operations and puts aside a provision each year for that piece of equipment to be replaced and charges that out to the operation, which is a mathematically pure way of doing it. And what we saw when we examined it in this previous situation that I performed the exercise was that the reserve went up to a level and never dropped below about a $10 million base. So you would never consume. You would always be able to replace the equipment, and you would never consume the $10 million base that sat in there. And so when we adjusted and took it down closer to a threshold, we took it down from 10 million to, I think, $2.5 million, freed up. Yeah. So you run a little closer to the edge, but you'd never run out of money. Anyway, we'll look, not to preempt what the outcome of that exercise might be, but those are the kind of things that, if we go about them in a rigorous fashion, may introduce some capacities in the organization that we didn't know we had. Debt then, not something that we would advocate using lightly, but it certainly is a tool that's available to municipalities for long-term, best used on long-term capital projects and as long as it's done within an affordable level so that you can handle the swings in the economy, the debt servicing should not be a problem. Next slide then looks at the capital budgets in their divisions. And again, these will go in much more detail tomorrow by each one of the directors. The first one is the infrastructure and protective services. And now this budget is this is taken from the approved capital plan from the 4-year budget cycle that we're living in right now. There are also throughout the year referrals that occur in the committee level where something will come up in committee and committee will ask that the item be referred to the budget for consideration in the next budget cycle. This number that you see, the $25.51 million in infrastructure and protective services, is the 4-year capital plan, approved capital plan without referrals. And the balance of funding, you can see capital tax, $3.8 million, reserves, $4 million, and provincial grants, $17.65 million in 2018, for a total of $25.5 million. 2018 community living budget, same type of process. We have not yet introduced the referred items. $5.7 million, capital tax just under $1 million, reserves just over $4 million, and provincial grants $732.6 million. Someone asked a question earlier today when we were talking about grants as to whether or not or how our access to grant funding compares with other municipalities, and that question has registered, so it will be applied on this type of analysis as well. It would be very interesting to see whether Grande Prairie is faring well in its access to provincial and federal grants vis-a-vis other municipalities in Alberta, or whether we're behind or ahead. The next slide.
Sorry, thanks, Councillor Clayton. My apologies. Councillor Friesen is also in the queue ahead of time. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Thanks for speaking up so that Councillor Friesen.
Thank you. These provincial grants, are they guaranteed grants, or is that something that in the years since this was approved may have altered some?
Mr. Manager, or do you want to direct that?
These are assured grants. These are grants that we know we will receive. And in fact, generally speaking, and Susan can correct me if I'm wrong, if we're relying on grants, we won't commence a project unless we know we've got the grant. And if we still like the project and the grant's refused, we'll come back to council and say, we didn't get the grant, but we'd still like to do the project. I think that occurred actually in the grandstand project for CKC Field. It was in for a significant grant. The grant was not approved. We came back to council and talked about other ways to finance it.
Councillor Platt. Councillor Platt.
Oh, sorry, I thought there was. Just so we have the 3 scenarios of that are put forward. I guess what I'm wondering is if we funded all the capital tax items that are in the capital budget, would we still achieve the same numbers in those 3 areas, or would it affect the 3 scenarios?
No, typically the capital budget won't affect the current year's operating budget.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Clayton.
I'll ask this question, although I'm sure it's just something simple, but explain to me are the reserves tied to be used in certain years, or how does it make sense that reserves for a particular, such as infrastructure and for protective services, is $4 million, where I see reserves that I'm assuming belong to that at higher amounts on the overall capital funding reserve list? Do you know what I mean? Like, for example, fire equipment fleet reserve, is it in corporate services or at $9 million, and then it shows like $4 million reserves in each committee? What am I missing?
No, this is how much, if I'm reading your question correctly, if we're flipping between the community living budget and the reserves, the reserves used in the community living budget are only those that will be consumed in 2018. Okay. So there's still a residual in the reserve itself.
Councillor Bressy.
My apologies. I might be re-asking Councillor Platt's question. I might have misunderstood the answer, but the capital budget we're looking at, if we approve that whole capital budget, that's reflected in the scenario base rates or not? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the capital budget and the operating budget are discrete in the current year. So if we, I don't think we have any debt financing in the capital budget right now, but if there was debt financing in the capital budget, it would show up in a subsequent year. Because these are either grant funded, capital tax funded, or reserve funded, they don't have an impact on the current year's operating budget. They're drawing from reserves.
My apologies. I'm still not understanding that. So if we're funding an item through capital tax, that's not going to affect the tax rate in 2018.
That's correct. The provision for capital tax money goes into the capital tax reserve, and then projects are funded out of it. So there's a relatively uniform contribution to the capital tax reserve, and that equalizes. It keeps us from going up and down as capital budgets change. But yes, so you're not wrong in principle, but the methodology gets around that swing by virtue of drawing from the reserve itself.
Great, thank you.
Were there no one else in the queue?
No one else in the queue right now?
The city manager and corporate services budget is $3.8 million, funded largely through capital tax and a smaller portion through reserves. And Susan will go through that in more detail as well. There were also a series of committee referred items. So these are the ones that, as the year went on, things came up and we were asked to refer them. And the only reason why they're separate here is because notionally the way the city of Grande Prairie has conducted this kind of business is that the capital plan was approved. These are incremental to the capital plan. The downtown incentives, the York Germain, the infill and facade improvement strategies, and the curling club new ice surface will be talked about in more detail tomorrow. But these were referred by committee and are part of the total list of the capital budget items. Infrastructure and protective services. Roads, there was a provision for land acquisition for roads. And this is Horacio will talk about this in more detail, but it's generally a provision of capital necessary to acquire lands for roads expansion and extensions that might be necessary going forward. So the only time that it's used is when that occurrence arises. And for strategic reasons, we don't identify where the land is that we're looking at acquiring. Railway crossing audits was something that came up in the course of the year. I'm even long enough in the tooth now that I remember this one coming up. And a study on the old landfill is something that was referred as well and has been included in the budget. Community living, heritage village improvements was referred by the committee to the budget process. Museum expansion was referred at $1.45 million. Koji will go through this in a lot more detail, but a big chunk of this one is intended to be funded through grants. And so the intention would be, as we go through this, that if that grant didn't come forward and the net amount be considerably smaller than this, management would have to come back to the council to talk about the new net amount. Regional Performing and Media Arts Facility, this was a study at $200,000. And the Muskasheepy Senior Playground Replacement at $400,000 was a committee referred item. All of those were items that management felt hit the same kind of priority that would have that would have rendered them part of the capital plan had they come up during the capital plan deliberations in the first place. There were a couple that we didn't feel hit that same priority, or we had a lack of clarity on, and so we did not physically recommend them in the budget and rather referred them to this table for discussion today. They are essentially, the big one is the downtown rehabilitation and construction project phases 3 and 4. That's a $30 million phase 3 or $15 million phase 3, $15 million phase 4, an optional addition to phase 3 at $3 million, and a communications plan at $250,000. What we've done, just so council can be comfortable at this point, is we've referred this item to the strategic issues arising portion of our deliberations. So our intention as management would be that we would have this discussion about whether this fits our current capital appetite while we talk about strategic issues within the community. There were also a couple of other ones that weren't recommended, and Horacio can go through the Safe Growth Grant one in more detail during his budget discussions. And the Evergreen Park one came up, and this was a recent one. Council will remember at the last council meeting, this one came up, and the suggestion was to refer it into the budget process. We didn't recommend it for two reasons, really. One, we'd already sort of set the budget that we intended to bring forward, and it didn't seem that there was any conclusion at the council level that would have caused us to rush in and change that. And two, we thought this one in isolation at $200,000 is not strategic at all, but we currently put about $4.6 million into community funding initiatives in Grande Prairie. Everything from STARS area ambulance, to the variety of community funding efforts that council will be quite familiar with. Last year, we added another $200,000 to that in the single year for 2017 to also fund things associated with the large tourism events that the community had been experiencing. And then last Monday, we saw Evergreen Park come in and look for another $200,000 that they actually would prefer to see each year for the next 5 years. So we thought, given that kind of an occurrence, we should put that on the list of strategic issues that we should talk about with council and get a feel for how this council feels about community funding. Particularly when we talk about scenario budgeting and taking a budget down to a zero increase, we did not go through and cut community funding levels. So our cut scenarios were involved pretty much entirely inside the departments. Community funding levels were left pretty much intact through that whole exercise. That's a strategic issue that we should probably talk about before we continue to cut net costs within the organization and leave community funding levels exactly where they are. So this one, the Evergreen Park one, was not, there's no judgment that's being asserted on the part of management as to whether or not that would be a worthwhile funding effort for us, but we think it should be seen in the larger strategic context. That leads us to the what we've referred to as strategic items for discussion and deliberation. And just to recap then, the issue of the Phase 3 and Phase 4 downtown project is something that is quite strategic. There's been a lot of discussion and a lot of dialogue, a lot of consultation, and 9 members of council who were out in the community for extended periods and probably have really good perspective on it. So with respect, the intention of management, at least at this point, would be that on Friday morning, these are the types of things that we start with. After you've had a chance to see the entire budget, we'll start with what we feel are the strategic items and add to them any strategic items that council might feel need to be done as well. We added to this list the snow removal strategy, in part because it is such a big deal in this community. It is such an impactful service in the community, and in part because there are some alternatives. Horacio and his team have come up with a very innovative solution that they feel they could pilot, and they'd like to be able to talk to council about what that might look like. Public engagement strategy. If for no other reason than the fact that we have a new council, we thought it important that we talk about whether or not we've got the right kind of resources in place to do the level of public engagement that you feel is appropriate in this community. And in the light of the fact that we're moving on some pretty impactful issues like priority-based budgeting that would certainly be enhanced by a proper public engagement strategy. So something we should talk about. We didn't put a dollar value against it and rather thought this would be something strategically that we could talk to council about. And the last one on the strategic items that we've been able to identify is this community funding strategy, and just ensuring that we're on target, either leaving it at the approximately $5 million in the community the way it is now, going through the processes that are currently in place, or if there's another strategic approach that council would have preferred to take, that we get a beat on what that is and start to implement that as well. So all of this, the last slide in my summary presentation then is just a summary of the operating and capital plans as you will see them fold out over the next day and as they've been incorporated into the various scenarios. The base budget that tried to get at the $4.8 million shortfall, that budget is the one that management is recommending and can be balanced with a 4.2% tax rate increase. The $3.4 million shortfall can be balanced with a 3% tax rate increase. And of course, target number 2, which is the 0 tax rate increase budget, needs no additional tax revenues in order to get it to balance. 2018 has a total revenue expense balance of about $160.5 million. It also has a capital plan, and you see it by division here, a capital plan that when we combine the approved and the recommended items that came from committee referrals, sits at about $40.5 million, and we leave the not recommended or strategic items off to the side for deliberation by council. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my overview, and the intention would be that tomorrow we would start to get into the divisional outlook, and that each one of the directors would take the council through the budget as it appears from the divisional perspectives.
Thanks very much, Mr. City Manager. So an opportunity maybe for some questions on what we've heard today. My recommendation to council would be, I think we want to have a clear mind as we start tomorrow, and ensure that we're working with administration, that none of their presentations get sort of broken up as we get towards the end of the day here. So my sense would be that we'd probably be concluding here, maybe with some questions for clarification if required, and then we'd start again tomorrow morning. But I see Councillor Bressy's in the queue already, so Councillor Bressy.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around what our task is for the next couple of days. Is administration's hope and recommendation that eventually when it gets to voting, we're just voting on the broad scenarios, this scenario, this scenario, this scenario, or is the hope and thinking that we get more granular than that?
Mr. Manager?
Through the chair, my hope would be that that we vote on, or the council votes on a budget. So not at a granular level. We can talk about any of the details and we can integrate them into how we would execute. But really the big issues here are the strategic issues, any strategic issues that need to be resolved by a discussion, and then a discussion about what the tolerances, appetites in the community might be for a tax rate increase that might be used to balance the budget against that level of expenditure. Your management team has gone through a pretty exhaustive exercise of looking at a number of different ways in which we can throttle back and throttle forward on a variety of variables in order to meet essentially whatever target you give us. And we would ideally find that the approval would come at a very high level, and we would bring you back a detailed budget that reflects the target tax rate increase, if there is to be one, that was approved by council in that exercise.
Great, thank you.
See Councillor O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Mayor Given. Question here. I've been on and I've gone through 3 budgets. This will be my 3rd, and each one of them was unique and different. At one point in time, we had the opportunity to flag items to get more information. So during this budget, is there going to be a need to have that items flagged, or are we going to have a direct explanation on where we're at with the item that we're talking about?
Mr. City Manager.
My hope, through the chair to Kevin, my hope would be that if the questions are at a sufficiently strategic and policy level to reflect the governance role of council, that between myself and the directors that are in the room, we should be able to respond to your questions in these sessions. Chances are, if we're getting down to a level of detail that can't be answered by the people that are in the room, we're at too low a level, we're at too granular a level of detail in the budget deliberation itself. Having said that, if there is a question by any council member on any item that constitutes this budget, you will get an answer. I would just encourage you to please try to keep them at a level that allows us to stay policy and stay strategic.
I appreciate your comments, and I'm looking forward to having the leaders of our departments. They should have enough information to answer the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor O'Toole. I guess the other thing, Council, as I look at the list of strategic items for discussion and deliberation, and I reflect back on what I heard in the election, if at the conclusion of this budget discussion, which is the final year of a 4-year budget, if I was able to go to the public and say that this council dealt one way or another with the downtown program, the snow removal program, and public engagement, I'd feel pretty confident that that was in alignment with the major themes that I heard through the course of the election. And in the absence of a more robust process along the lines of priority-based budgeting, or something that we really get into it with the community about what our priorities are, those certainly are reflective, by and large, of the priorities that I heard in the election. There's maybe one that isn't reflected in there that we might have heard a fair bit about in terms of election time and campaigns. With respect to photo radar and automated enforcement. But, so I guess I'd just sort of provide that for council's consideration, as in the course of affecting a 1-year budget, if we have some influence on the property tax increase and these items, for me, that's pretty close to the issues that the community said that they wanted this council to respond to. Councillor Minhas?
Thank you, Mayor Belgivan. Just a clarification is that's the 250,000. That's already included in 18 budget deficit.
No, through the chair, that has not been included at all until and unless council makes a decision on it. But if it were to be debt financed, chances are there wouldn't be a debt payment due in 2018 in any event. So the 2018 budget can be set with continued deliberation on that item.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions of clarification or process? Seeing none, then do I have a head nod of concurrence that we'll start with the departmental presentations tomorrow morning, and everybody can be fresh. We can all go home and shovel our sidewalks, which, from looking out the council chambers, it looks like there'll be a fair bit of work for us all when we get home, and a fair bit of work for us all when we get started tomorrow morning. So with that, we'll conclude our day and look to get started again bright and early tomorrow.
Is it too early for me to be tired of shoveling snow? I guess.
No. Sorry.
I'm actually looking to hire someone.